Noam Chomsky is a professor of linguistics at MIT University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He's been a political activist and critic of U.S. foreign policy since the Vietnam War. He's the author of more than 80 books on politics, media studies, linguistics, philosophy, and psychology. His latest book is Middle East Illusions. And for the next 3 hours, Noam Chomsky will be taking your phone calls and emails as our guest on Book TV's In Depth.
Well, some of it I do because I find it intellectually challenging and exciting and demanding, and some of it I do because I just feel it has to be done. So, people are suffering bitterly throughout the world. There are a lot of things we can do about it, and that seems to me a responsibility that comes with privilege and freedom, which we have to an unusual degree, maybe unique degree, to involve ourselves in these issues.
What do you think of the United States?
Well, I think it's a complicated country. It has wonderful achievements. It's in some domains, it's gone beyond any other country in the world. Protection for freedom of speech, for example, many other liberties. It's got tremendous advantages, incomparable. Had the biggest economy in the world over a century ago. I don't think it's used them properly. There's plenty of many of the actions that the U.S. government has taken in the world, I think, are deplorable and should be stopped and reversed. You can't really comment on a country. There's just too many facets to it. There's a society, there's a culture, there's just too many things. I mean, when I take my grandson to a baseball game, as I did last Sunday, I enjoy being part of mainstream America. When I look at U.S. government foreign policy or the domestic, highly regressive domestic policies, I'm extremely critical.
Noam Chomsky will be with us for just a little under 3 hours, and we will go to the phones in the next several minutes. But for the first part of this program, we want to chat a bit about his life. Philadelphia played a big role in your life. What year were you born?
I was born in 1928 in Philadelphia. Immigrant, first-generation immigrant family, Jewish. My parents were very much involved, in fact, immersed in the Jewish community, Hebrew culture. My father was a Hebrew scholar, ran the Hebrew school systems. My mother taught in it, deeply committed to Zionism. We have to remember that that was something different then from what it is today. Actually, I grew up in a community in which we were, for most of the time, the only Jewish family in a mostly German and Irish Catholic community, and there were a lot of problems, which incidentally my parents never knew about, but the streets were complicated places.
Problems for you that
Yeah.
they never knew? Give us an example.
Well, as I say, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in those. This is the 1930s, deeply anti-Semitic period. I don't like to say it, but I grew up with a kind of a visceral fear of Catholics. I knew it was irrational and got over it, but it was just the street experience. There were periods these were periods of complex ethnic conflicts in the cities. There were times when I was a young teenager where in Philadelphia there was a curfew, I think a 7 or 8 o'clock curfew on teenagers. If we wanted to go out in the evening, we had to have parental authority. There were times when the walk from the subway station to the Hebrew school was under police guard. And it wasn't just Jews were not, there was a lot of anti-Semitism, but it went in all directions. Actually, you get a pretty good picture of it from some of the novels written about the period describing urban ethnic conflicts, which are complicated and real. Grew up in the middle of them.
Where had your parents come from, and what were they like?
My father had come from Ukraine right before the First World War, escaping the Tsarist army. My mother had come from what's now Belarus. Her family, she came when she was a baby, actually. But and the two families were first-generation immigrant families.
What were they like? What were your parents like?
Well, had a very warm, loving childhood. I look back at it with a lot of warmth and affection. They were both working. They taught Hebrew school, so I was in school actually from all day from the time I was about a year and a half old. I was actually in early years up to high school in a experimental school that was run by Temple University, a Deweyite school. Wonderful place. I don't know if there's anything like it today. It fostered creative activity. There was no competition. Actually, I didn't know I was a good student until I got to high school, because the question never arose. You know, you weren't graded by your achievements. I mean, I knew I skipped a class, but I didn't think anything particular of it, and nor did anyone else. It was a very healthy, exciting intellectual and social environment.
Why did you decide to go to the University of Pennsylvania, where you got, I believe, your undergraduate, your master's, and your PhD?
Question never arose. You didn't go in, the idea of leaving home was inconceivable. Yet we were working students, both my wife and I. You lived at home, you went to the local school, worked in the afternoons. The concept of going away to college just wasn't in the, didn't exist. The question never came up.
When did you first get interested in linguistics?
That was sort of accident. Well, it's complicated. Actually, my father was a Hebrew scholar. He did work on medieval Hebrew grammar, and growing up as a child, I read his manuscripts and drafts of a book and so on. I was kind of intrigued by it. But then I happened to, through political contacts, to meet Zelig Harris, who I later discovered was the most important and influential linguist in the country. He happened to be teaching at the University of Pennsylvania. I was actually on the verge of dropping out of college at that time. I was pretty bored with it. I got in at 16, and a lot of anticipation and excitement, and was mostly killed in the first year. And I was not really committed to staying. I met him, and he drew me back into college. I suspect in retrospect that he was doing it on purpose, but I don't know. Anyhow, I started taking his graduate courses, and through his influence, other, also mostly graduate courses in other fields. And he was an extremely brilliant and exciting person in many respects. And my interests developed through those contacts, and then on from there.
When did you meet your wife, Carol?
She was about 2 years old, and I was about 4 years old, I guess. These were closely knit communities. She was also from a Jewish community. Her father and mother were from European immigrants, and the families knew each other, and we had sort of met as children, and it went through a kind of similar history, Hebrew schools, Hebrew camps. By the time we were teenagers, we interacted in a different fashion. We married pretty young. She was 19, I had just turned 21.
There are people that say there are two Noam Chomskys, as you know, the linguist and the political activist. Which one of those do you prefer?
Well, I can't really say. If the world would go away, I would be very happy to keep to what's called my professional work, linguistics, philosophy, cognitive science, and so on, which I do find exciting, exhilarating, challenging, and demanding, and easily could easily put my full-time activities into it. On the other hand, the other activities in their own way are difficult, rewarding, complicated, also challenging, and necessary.
Again, if you've just joined us, our guest for the next 2 hours and 45 minutes is Noam Chomsky, who is now located at MIT. How long have you been there?
Almost 50 years.
What year did you go there and why?
I went there in 1955, and actually at that time I had been at Harvard for 4 years in a graduate fellowship, and had just gotten a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, where I actually hadn't been for 4 years. I had no recognized academic field. The work that I was doing didn't fit anywhere. It didn't have any academic home, and I had no particular expectations of going on into an academic career, because for one thing, there didn't seem to be any possibilities. But I did receive an invitation from MIT to be in the electronics lab. I don't know a tape recorder from a telephone practically, and I know nothing about electronics, but I was, the electronics lab at the time was directed by Jerry Wiesner, later became Kennedy's science advisor, who was a very imaginative person. The laboratory itself was a mixture of all kinds of exciting activities. A good deal of MIT at that time was in a transition from being primarily an engineering school to becoming primarily, in fact, totally a science-based university. It's a 10-year transition, which had a lot to do with things happening in American science and technology and so on. And the electronics lab where I was the center of a lot of these activities. Biology, neurophysiology, mathematics, linguistics, acoustics, just on and on. Many of these were experimental efforts. It wasn't at all clear that they were going to go anywhere. Some of them succeeded very well, others failed, but it was a great ferment of intellectual excitement and interaction and challenge. There were other places like it at the same time, for example, Bell Laboratories. And as I was primarily in the electronics lab in a research position, but I also was asked to do some teaching. I was able to teach introductory linguistics and philosophy courses, the first ones in these areas that had been taught there, but mainly my service to the university was teaching cram courses in French and German to graduate students who in those days had to pass a reading exam in French and German, which they considered a total waste of time because they knew they were never going to look at anything. And there was a technique for sort of getting them through the exam, essentially teaching them to fake their way through the exam, and that's the courses I was teaching for a couple of years. On
the screen is some shots of Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which is on the Charles River, right across from Boston, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. How many students there, do you know?
I think there's roughly, last time I looked, it was about 4,000 undergraduates, and I think about maybe twice that many graduate students, something roughly on that order.
My background on you says that you have published 65 political books and 33 linguistic books from a total of 60 different publishers. We have been doing book shows here for many, many years. I've never heard of anybody publishing 98 books.
Well, a lot of those books are collections of talks, interviews. If you looked at the ones I actually sat down and wrote, it wouldn't come to anything like that.
What was your first?
First book? The first book was called Syntactic Structures, and that was actually not intended for publication. It was notes for an undergraduate linguistics course at MIT, which at that time this material was basically unpublishable. It did not belong in any recognized field. I had submitted a couple of articles to journals which were returned. I'd submitted a book for publication and it was returned, MIT Press, was returned with the sensible comment that this didn't seem to belong anywhere and I ought to wait until the field exists before trying to submit a book, which was not an unreasonable comment. It did come out 20 years later. By then the field had been established. The first Syntactic Structures was actually notes, which a Dutch publisher who visited saw sitting on my desk and asked if I would put it together and let them publish it as a monograph, and they did.
What was your first political book?
First political book was American Power and the New Mandarins, which was a collection of essays, came out in 1969. It's just been reprinted. It was essays and talk, mostly, a lot of them based on talks, through the 1960s. Starting around 1963, I became pretty much involved in Vietnam War issues and was giving many talks, usually to audiences of 2 or 3 people. There was absolutely no interest at the time. But over the years it built up, and by the late 60s there were way more invitations and opportunities than I could take up. I was also directly involved in activism and resistance. I have to say, for years, every time I came to Washington, the first thought that came to mind was the smell of tear gas. I was in and out of demonstrations, in and out of jail a number of times. The essays were a collection of, in the book, were a collection of talks, commentary, discussions based on these activities.
I have on my lap here a Norman Mailer book called The Armies of the Night. And up at the top is a picture of you back in 1967. What were you doing there at the Pentagon?
That was a big demonstration at the Pentagon in, I suppose it was October 1967. One of the first large-scale national demonstrations, not the first, but one of the biggest on a national level. Actually, Mailer and I ended up in adjacent cots in a detention center somewhere after we were arrested.
Over the years, lots of controversy, lots of books. We're going to go to the phones in about 10 minutes, and they'll have a chance to deal with these. But the other book that I have in my lap, and I've got a lot of your books, is one, it's a small one. It's called 9/11, and it was a bestseller. What's your main point in this book about 9/11?
Well, that book is a collection of interviews. It's a sample of interviews, and it happens to be just those that happen to be electronically stored. So, for example, it doesn't include interviews on BBC and so on. Right after 9/11, there was a massive requests from the United States and around the world for discussion of the events, their background, what they meant, what they were going to lead to, and this is a slightly edited collection of a number of those interviews. The point was, if there is a single point, that we should be aware of the role that we play in the world. What happened on 9/11 is a horrifying atrocity. It's probably the worst single act of large-scale terror that's ever taken place. I don't think there's another single case where thousands of people were killed in one act. On the other hand, for much of the world, the response to 9/11 was welcome to the club. We've been through this, and you've often done it to us. So, for example, I've forgotten whether I quoted it in there, but the research journal of the Jesuit University in Managua, Nicaragua, which is one of the main research journals in Central America, they published an editorial immediately after 9/11 describing it, as everyone did, as a horrifying atrocity, expressing sympathy for the victims, saying you could call it Armageddon. And then they added, but we have been through our own Armageddon in slow motion under massive terrorist attack organized and directed by the United States, which led to tens of thousands of people killed and the country practically ruined and may never recover. So we do sympathize with the terrible atrocity that was carried out against you, but it's not unfamiliar to us. And that was a reaction through a good deal of the world. That's why if you look at there was an international Gallup poll taken shortly after September 11th. I think it was about September 20th, or roughly in that, about a week after, asking, this was at a time when the bombing of Afghanistan had in effect been announced, but it had not yet been undertaken, so it was in that interim period. And the question asked around the world was, do you support, if what it said actually is, if the perpetrators of the terrorist attack are identified on that assumption, would you be in favor of bombing the place where they came from, their refuge? And then there were two questions. If it attacked only military targets, second, if it also hit civilians. Well, it was never published in the United States, but the responses were interesting. There was very little support for the policy that was actually undertaken. And incidentally, we should say that they hadn't identified the perpetrators. But in Latin America, which is the region of most experience with U.S. domination and intervention, the support was extremely low. It ranged from about 2% in support in Mexico to about 11%, I think, in Colombia and Venezuela. The only marginal exception was Panama, which has a very Anglo an American component there. And even there, 16% supported bombing. I think 80% supported diplomatic means, efforts for extradition. And that reflects a history of experience, long experience. So yes, all over the world there was overwhelming sympathy for the victims, horror of the terrible atrocity, but a recognition that life's more complicated. We've been on the receiving end for a long time from European imperialism, which was violent and destructive, and from the U.S. variant of it. And I think it's only first of all, it's the merest honesty to face this. But if we're interested in reducing the threat of terrorism, which is enormous, if you want to really be frightened, read the recent Hart-Rudman study, sponsored study of the Council on Foreign Relations on terrorist threats to the United States, and they're pretty awesome. Well, if you hope to reduce and lessen these threats, you have to make a crucial distinction between the terrorists themselves, who are carrying out criminal acts, and you treat it like criminal acts, and the reservoir of in which their message kind of resonates, even among people who hate and despise them, but nevertheless recognize some authenticity to what they say. And it's that reservoir of, you can't really call it sympathy, but understanding, where real grievances lie that have to be dealt with. That's true no matter what kind of terrorism you're facing. If you want to reduce the threat, pay attention to the grievances from which they arise, and if they're legitimate, and they often are, deal with them. For one thing, because they're legitimate. For another, because it's just sanity if you're hoping to reduce the terror. These are topics discussed in the book, in their interviews.
Just tuned in. Noam Chomsky is our guest, and we're going to go to the phones. We have a call from Maryville, Illinois. First up, go ahead, please.
Hello, Dr. Chomsky. I was introduced to your writings and works as an undergraduate about 4 years ago at the University of Illinois, and I was intrigued by your the straightforwardness that you had in your writings. And I first read them on ZNet. And anyway, my question, it's a two-part question. They're unrelated parts. My first question is, where do you attribute the incompetence of today's leaders in this country as compared to, the leaders such as FDR and, in the early 20th century, men of distinction and honor? I know, presidents like Andrew Jackson and some other ones were, not very honorable. But where do you attribute this? I mean, it's been decades now where we've had leaders, one after the other, just promote these policies and enact these these wars and these where do you attribute that to?
Thanks, caller. That's good.
Well, I'm not sure I would use the word incompetence. I mean, I think they're very competent. They know what they're doing. They're dedicated, committed. They even tell us very frankly what they're doing. So, for example, the national security strategy that was announced last September was a very clear, brazen statement of a program of sustaining world dominance by means of force and announcing the intention to rely on force to suppress any potential challenge to that dominance. Now, that's quite a departure as a policy statement, and it sent many shudders around the world, including the foreign policy elite at home. But there's nothing incompetent about it. It's a very clear, explicit statement, frank statement. Why they're pursuing those policies? Well, we can look at them. But if we take an honest look at the past, it's not very pretty. I mean, we can ask, for example, why we're sitting where we're sitting. There were people here, after all, lots of them, millions of them. What happened to them? Well, the founding fathers were pretty frank about it. They knew what they were doing. So John Quincy Adams, for example, many years after his own very ugly contributions to this were over, did have a change of heart, and he condemned what they had done in what he called exterminating the hapless race of Native Americans with ferocious cruelty, or words approximately like that. They understood what they were doing. They cleared the continent. They conquered half of Mexico in a war which was bitterly condemned within the country. Correctly, it was a terrible war. A century ago, the United States conquered the Philippines, killed a couple 100,000 people. That a good part of the military command ended up facing war crimes trials afterwards. There was bitter condemnation of that too. Mark Twain, for example, the leading, maybe the leading writer in the United States, wrote very bitter, sardonic anti-war essays. And we can go on. The history has not been a pretty one. And that's why after the national territory was conquered, power extended to the region. The United States was not a major actor in the global scene until after the Second World War, but it was regionally the dominant power in the Caribbean and Central America, extending to Hawaii, which was taken from its own citizens by force and guile, onto the Philippines, but particularly in Central America and the Caribbean. And those are not, if you take a look at the record there, it's not at all attractive.
Washington, D.C., for Noam Chomsky, good morning.
Good day. Well, there's more like 300,000 in the Philippines, and that's my point and my disagreement with Mr. Chomsky. It's too general, Mr. Chomsky. It has to be specific as a prosecutor and factually, and the facts are known. The body counts are well known, and everyone quotes them incorrectly. That's my disagreement with you. I like your work very much, and many people follow you, but I think you need to, if Hussein's criminal to be prosecuted, then our involvement and participation, and Helmut Kohl's involvement and participation in the 80s is a prosecutable crime also, and also our uranium war crimes, or the wars in Ethiopia. James Baker restarted in 91, and now 20 million Ethiopians are in risk of starving to death, and there's plenty of food in this world. There's no famine without war. This is the heart of the matter, and the generalizations goes farther away from it. Look at their faces, see them, and thank you for your time.
Well, I certainly agree with you that one should be accurate about the facts, and if you would like to bring up some specific questions about facts, I'd be happy to think about them, and if I made a mistake, to correct it. You're right about the tremendous suffering and agony throughout the world. Much of it it's not, it's by no means all the result of U.S. policy, obviously not. Problems in Africa are extremely ugly and complex. In the Congo alone, several million people have been killed in the last few years in wars that would not be easy to handle and deal with, though a good deal could be done about them. There's plenty of starvation. I don't think war is the only factor that lies behind famine. Often famines take place when, as you say, there's plenty of food, but social and political conditions are such that the food isn't getting to the people who need it. And there's plenty that can be done about that. The AIDS epidemic is devastating, not only Africa, but many other parts of the world. And resources, there are methods of treatment which require not huge sums of money. And we could dedicate ourselves, our portion of our resources, to dealing with that. We have ample resources, many of them being used in destructive ways. But your point is correct. There's all sorts of horrible things going on in the world. Some of them we're responsible for. And there we have a direct responsibility to terminate what we're doing and improve the situation. Others are things we could assist, and to the extent possible we have a responsibility to do that. There are plenty of others which are going to be well out of our control.
This book called Middle East Illusions is in the bookstores right now. It's by Noam Chomsky. As we go to North Andover, Massachusetts, you're next. Go ahead, please.
Well, Professor Chomsky, good afternoon. I'm honored to ask you a question. I have, when you said to us the grandson that you were able to enjoy a baseball game with last week, with your love of words and your love of linguistics, I was just curious if you ever had the opportunity to have any connection with Mr. Edward L. Bernays, who was a resident of Cambridge for the last 40 years of his life, was first in New York City, and was for almost 100 years connected with, very powerfully, the public affairs work of the American Tobacco Company, working with Guatemala for a war that almost was started because of bananas in the 50s, and all of these different media actions that I believe have really contributed to where we are now in our worldview of, we have got a corporate mentality of destroying what we don't like, taking it over, manipulation of it, because his learning from his uncle, Sigmund Freud, was utilized to his best ability with twisting people's view of what was good for them so that he could sell products to them.
Thanks, caller. Eddie Bernays.
Actually, you're right, he lived in Cambridge. We weren't that far apart. I never actually met him. But,
called the father of public relations.
Yeah. But I've written a fair amount. I've looked at a lot of his work, and in fact I've written a fair amount about it. I suspect that it wasn't his Freud who was the big influence on him, but rather, in fact, exactly what he said. He said the major influence on him was his participation in the first state propaganda agency in the United States, Woodrow Wilson's Committee on Public Information, which was established in order to try to drive a basically pacifist population into support for the war that Wilson very much wanted to get into in Europe, and it succeeded. Within a short period of time, the propaganda efforts, they were called propaganda in those days, it was more honest use of terminology. The propaganda efforts of the Committee on Public Information, a very Orwellian name, did succeed in driving a pacifist population into raving anti-German fanatics, to the point where the Boston Symphony Orchestra couldn't play Beethoven, things like that. It drove the country into a kind of hysteria. And the participants in that committee included many people of subsequent great distinction and influence. Edward Bernays was one. Another was Walter Lippmann, the leading public intellectual of the 20th century and most important figure in American media. Both of them went through that experience and learned from it and wrote about what they learned from it. What they learned, as Bernays put it in a famous book of his called Propaganda, late 1920s, I think, he said that we have learned that the intelligent minorities can engineer consent through the use of manipulation, propaganda, and control. And we should do it for the benefit of the public. It's for the benefit of the public that we should control them and engineer their consent. Lippmann said pretty much the same thing. Also drawing from the experience of the wartime propaganda agency, he wrote important essays on democracy in the 1920s called Progressive Essays on Democracy. They were both liberals, kind of Wilsonian progressives. He said, well, we've learned that there's a new art in the practice of democracy, the art of what he called manufacturing consent. Bernays' term was engineering of consent. And this is very significant because the public should not be participants in the democratic process. They should be spectators, not participants. They are ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, as he put it. And for their own benefit, we, the intelligent minority, the responsible men, must control them. Bernays' particular significance, this had all sorts of influence all over the place, but in the intellectual culture, in political science, and so on. But Bernays' particular influence was exactly as you say, he was one of the founders of the modern public relations industry, which grew into a massive industry right at that period. Had it existed before, but it became very important after at this time. And its goal was to control attitudes, beliefs, to marginalize people, to induce, to drive them towards what were called the superficial things of life, like fashionable consumption, and keep them out of the public arena where they don't belong. Bernays' first major achievement was a program that convinced women to smoke cigarettes. Women didn't smoke in those days, but he had an elaborate public relations program, including models walking down Fifth Avenue, to show, with cigarettes, showing this is what modern women are like. And it did succeed in turning women into smokers with a toll that we need not discuss. The Guatemala case, you're correct. He was the public relations, he ran the public relations for the propaganda effort to support the overthrow of the democratic government of Guatemala, which led to horrifying atrocities which the country is still suffering from. This is one of the examples that we should be anything but proud of, and he did play a role on that. He did a lot of other things. He's famous in Cambridge for a campaign to save the sycamores on Memorial Drive, which was again a successful public relations campaign that many people admired.
Springfield, Massachusetts, for Noam Chomsky. Hello.
Good afternoon, Professor Chomsky. My question to you is, do you believe that a nation should suffer a detrimental cost in order to compensate for wrongs committed by the governors of that nation or by segments of that nation in the past?
I'm not sure exactly what the question means. Are we if you're living under, let me see if I can understand it. Suppose you're living under a dictatorship, and the dictators carry out some horrendous act. So you're living in Stalinist Russia, let's say, and Stalin carries out horrible crimes. Are the people of Russia responsible for those crimes? Well, to only a very limited extent, because living under a brutal, harsh terrorist regime, there isn't very much they can do about it. There's something they could do, and to the extent that you can do something, you're responsible for what happens. Suppose you're living in a free democratic society with lots of privilege, enormous, incomparable freedoms, and the government carries out violent, brutal acts. Are you responsible for it? Yeah, a lot more responsible, because there's a lot you can do about it. And therefore, the cost of if you share responsibility in criminal acts, you are liable for the consequences.
Jacksonville, Florida. Good afternoon.
Hi, Professor Chomsky. It's an honor to speak to you, sir. I'd like to have you address the idea of 9/11 as like a false flag or a let it happen on purpose kind of situation. I mean, it's not exactly unprecedented in American history, or world history for that matter, especially given the Project for the American Century, where Paul Wolfowitz said that it would take like a Pearl Harbor-like attack on America to be able to implement their plans. And could you address that for me, please?
Well, I know that's a widely held belief. Frankly, I'm personally extremely skeptical about it. I don't think there's any likelihood that an action like that could have been planned, and I don't really think there are any historical precedents for it. If the White House had been in any way involved in planning this, it would have been an act of absolute madness on their part. For one thing, you could never tell where it was going to go. For another, it would certainly have leaked. I mean, it's inconceivable that a plan of that nature wouldn't have leaked. And it just doesn't make any sense, in my opinion. And I don't think the evidence is at all compelling. I've read what there is. You're quite right about the exploitation of it. When it happened, it was exploited, not just in the United States, but all over the world. So, for example, the Russians were exploited September 11th as they saw it as a window of opportunity to step up their really brutal repression and violence in Chechnya, presenting it as a struggle against terrorism, and expecting to get authorization from the United States, the world ruler, which indeed happened. Israel used it as a window of opportunity to step up repression in the occupied territories, claiming it's a war against terror. China did the same in Western China, where they're carrying out, again, harsh repressive activities against dissident, sometimes rebel groups, again expecting U.S. authorization, which they got. All over the world, governments, including more democratic governments, used it as an opportunity to impose more discipline on their own populations. So yes, it was recognized throughout the world by state power as an opportunity to increase repressive actions that were underway, to impose discipline and so on. But that doesn't mean that all those countries planned it. They just recognized it as a window of opportunity. And I think the same was true here.
If you've just joined us, we have about 2 hours and 15 minutes to go on our in-depth program on this Sunday afternoon with Noam Chomsky. Next call, Peoria, Illinois. Hello.
Hello. I'd like to question the effectiveness of demonstrations, and especially civil disobedience, in effectively changing U.S. policy. In the Vietnam War, it dragged out for 17 years. Public opinion turned against the war in 1968, yet the war dragged on for 7 more years, and the opinion polls and public opinion research showed that the public, even though they hated the war, they hated the demonstrators even more. So that just prolonged the war. And like we have a march here in Peoria, a rally against the war in Iraq, we had 200 marchers. We got 5 inches in the newspaper, 1 little inch of new information why people should be against the war. You're never going to be able to demonstrate in the street, get coverage like that, and get your message across. You had to do direct, door-to-door lit dropping, literature dropping, stuffing doorknobs or canvassing door to door to get your message out with a full sheet of paper with all your arguments. The media is not going to do your job for you. They're not get your message across in the detail and